Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So obviously on today's program, we are going to talk about what happened Wednesday at the Capitol in Washington. It was an absolute disgrace. We're also going to talk to Sam Mullins, who was in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol building during the protest. I recorded an interview with him Thursday morning as he was driving back from Washington, and we will play that a little later in the program. But first, we need to talk about what happened. What happened on Wednesday with the protesters storming the Capitol building was an absolute disgrace. But whose fault was it? Well, obviously the protesters who stormed the Capitol building are responsible for their own actions, so it's their own fault. And they should be condemned for what they did. But do you know who's really at fault? Donald Trump? No. Mike Pence? No. Nancy Pelosi? No. Any member of Congress? No. Joe Biden? There are 9 people responsible for what happened Wednesday. And those 9 people are John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Stephen Breyer, Samuel Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. The Supreme Court of the United States. That is who is responsible for what happened on Wednesday. Because they were the only body that had the authority to prevent it, had they performed their constitutional duty. Yes, it's a disgrace that the protesters breached the Capitol. But it's also a disgrace that the Supreme Court set up the circumstances where those protesters felt they had no other options. The results of this election were disputed. Regardless of the merits of those disputes, the plaintiffs deserved their day in court. In our system, the judiciary is the arbiter of disputes. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter. And they punted, which makes them traitors. All 9 of them. President Kennedy said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Similarly, those who allow our Constitution to be flagrantly violated will make its violent restoration inevitable. That the U.S. Supreme Court refused to even consider one shred of evidence that there was wrongdoing in the 2020 elections is an absolute travesty of justice and a disgraceful abrogation of the court's constitutional duty. And that is the reason the Capitol was breached by protesters on Wednesday. I will never accept Joe Biden as the legitimate president of the United States unless the Supreme Court agrees to hear the evidence that this election was tainted and issues a detailed opinion explaining their decision. Although I can't imagine any valid defense to the unconstitutional election process that occurred in at least 6 states, if the Supreme Court validates it, so be it. That's our system. But to refuse to hear the evidence and rule on it is inexcusable. And it will inevitably lead to violence, as it already has. But don't be surprised if what we saw Wednesday becomes the least of the violence. The resulting bloodshed will be on the hands of every person, both in and out of government, who opposed pursuit of the truth as to what happened in the election. And the Supreme Court's inaction will be the cause of it. In lawsuits between states, the Supreme Court is the court of original jurisdiction, meaning cases don't go through district and circuit courts first. The High Court dismissed the Texas v. Pennsylvania case based solely on a lack of standing, not a lack of merit. And that dismissal was erroneous, in my opinion. It was dismissed without the court ever even considering any merits of the case whatsoever. Texas was asking to be heard on their claim that Pennsylvania and some other states conducted their elections in an unconstitutional manner. And Texas was correct in that regard, because those states ran their elections without the due process and equal protection as required by the Constitution of the United States and confirmed by the Supreme Court's 2000 Bush v. Gore decision. Texas argued that the constitutional right of its citizens for the President of the United States to be elected in a lawful manner was violated when other states conducted illegal elections. Well, our Constitution says, quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government." And that's, of course, lowercase r in Republican. And it's Article 4, Section 4. Well, that Republican form of government means one that is properly elected in accordance with the Constitution of the nation, the constitutions of the individual states, and the laws created under them. And it is indisputable that that did not occur in at least 6 states. Texas was not trying to tell other states how to run their elections properly. They were just insisting that because those states did not run their elections constitutionally, that their results be dismissed by the court, and the electors instead chosen by the legislature, or absent that, Congress. Plan B and Plan C, both outlined in the Constitution, and are obviously, therefore, constitutional remedies to those electors being dismissed by the court. Had the Supreme Court not dismissed the case, and had they abided by stare decisis as they usually do, they would have thrown out the results in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. California and New Jersey also conducted unconstitutional elections, but they weren't named in the lawsuit, so they wouldn't have been affected. Although new lawsuits against those states would have resulted in their elections being invalidated. Well, the court's refusal to do its duty is an affirmation that a state may violate its Constitution and the Constitution of the United States with impunity, and that election laws may be violated by officials anytime they want with no repercussions whatsoever. And a constitutional republic cannot survive that. You know, Wednesday night during the House debate of the challenge, Representative Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from Maryland, got all arrogant on his high horse and tried quoting Thomas Paine. He said, "In the monarchies, the king is the law. But in the democracies, the law is the king." All right, close enough paraphrase, not exact. But that's not what happened. The law was not the sovereign in the 2020 presidential election. The law was unconstitutionally changed. The law was ignored. The law was not equally applied. So don't give me this, the law is the king. We're a nation of laws, not men. Because insofar as the 2020 presidential election is concerned, we're a nation entirely of men and not laws. Because we completely ignored our laws. Let's take our first break and then we will come back and continue this when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. As I said at the beginning of the program, I blame the Supreme Court for what happened on Wednesday. The problem is that the state of Texas was never even given the opportunity to present their arguments before the court. I believe that if the court had heard the case and issued a decision, they would have invalidated the elections in those 4 states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. But even if they didn't, at least they would have done their duty to settle the dispute. By abrogating that responsibility, the issue will forever be in dispute. And that doubt is unhealthy and it's dangerous. The Supreme Court is the ultimate referee in our system of government. They're like the officials at the championship football game. What they say goes. Even if they got the call wrong, what they say goes. We all understand that. But they have to make the call. And in the national championship game of the presidential election, no one disputes the game-winning touchdown was scored with the offense having 12 players on the field. No one disputes the game-winning touchdown pass was scored by a wide receiver who was offsides on the play. No one disputes the game-winning touchdown pass was thrown by a quarterback who was past the line of scrimmage when he threw it. No one disputes the game-winning touchdown was scored on a play that multiple offensive linemen committed uncalled holding penalties. No one disputes the wide receiver also committed pass interference by pushing away the defender after the ball was thrown. So what does the losing team do? The losing team throws down the red flag calling for a review of the play by the officials. But in this instance, the officials, the Supreme Court, refused to review the play and simply walked off the field with no time left on the clock. Game over, no official review. But the cameras clearly show what actually happened. So what happened is not in dispute. The cameras very clearly show that if the officials had reviewed the play, it would have been obvious it was not a valid touchdown. But the officials never even looked. That presidential national championship game was the Patriots versus Steelers. And the Steelers won. And that's Stealers. Because just like the football analogy I just gave, no one disputes the fact that Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia all changed their election procedures by means other than through the legislatures who have the sole plenary power to do it. No one disputes the fact that Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia all treated vote-by-mail ballots in manners not authorized by either state law, the state's constitution, or both. No one disputes the fact that the validity of vote-by-mail ballots in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia were not judged via uniform statewide standards. No one disputes the fact that Pennsylvania accepted late vote-by-mail ballots. No one disputes the fact that election officials in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, counted ballots that lacked legally required information. No one disputes the fact that Pennsylvania's Secretary of State, with the concurrence of the Commonwealth Supreme Court, voided signature requirements for absentee ballots without getting approval from the legislature. No one disputes the fact that Michigan's Secretary of State solicited millions of absentee ballots without the lawful authority to do it, and allowed online ballot requests to be processed without the signature verification required under Michigan law. No one disputes the fact that 70% of absentee ballot poll books in Detroit, Michigan were out of balance but certified anyway. No one disputes the fact that big city Wisconsin mayors set up unmanned ballot collection boxes despite a state law specifically prohibiting them from doing it. No one disputes the fact that Wisconsin election officials counted ballots that were delivered to their offices by means not permitted under Wisconsin law. No one disputes the fact that Wisconsin election officials counted vote-by-mail ballots that did not contain voter information required by statute. No one disputes the fact that Georgia's Secretary of State and State Elections Board bypassed the legislature to impose new rules that materially altered the rules required by Georgia law. No one disputes the fact that Arizona allowed voter registration long after the deadline that was established by the legislature. No one disputes any of those facts. What is disputed is whether or not those facts made those elections unconstitutional. I think they did. I think the Constitution itself and the precedent set by the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore clearly meant those elections were unconstitutional. But whether or not it actually is unconstitutional isn't up to me, sad to say. I wish it was. But whether or not it is actually unconstitutional is up to the federal courts and ultimately the Supreme Court. Do they think those elections were unconstitutional? We don't know. And we'll never know, because the court failed this nation by refusing to issue an opinion. But I don't see how anyone with an ounce of objectivity could possibly find that those undisputed occurrences were constitutional. How could they be? It's not a matter of interpretation. Either the plain text was followed or it was not. And in this instance, it was not. That makes those elections prima facie unconstitutional. Those elections were conducted in violation of the U.S. Constitution and the constitutions of those states. and the laws of those states. And that was sufficient basis to toss the results and allow the legislatures of the affected states to choose electors as permitted by our Constitution. But we never got that far because the Supreme Court refused to perform their constitutional duty. I fear that we are witnessing the death of our republic. And I think when historians look back at this, they will blame the Supreme Court's inaction for the violence that followed. The legitimacy of our government is entirely dependent upon the legitimacy of how it was elected. In a free republic, government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Does Joe Biden have the lawful consent of the governed? We'll never know, because the Supreme Court shamefully refused to perform its duty and settle the dispute. Do not misinterpret my words to mean that I am advocating a violent revolution. More violence is the last thing we need in this country. There is no need to try to read between the lines with me because I say what I mean and I mean what I say. And I'm pretty direct about it. Some people call it blunt, arrogant, or self-righteous. Well, it is blunt, but it's not arrogance. It's confidence. And it's a confidence that is deserved from 50 years of intense study of the kinds of topics I discuss on this program. Do I believe my opinions are correct? Well, of course I do, or I'd change my opinions. And my facts are spot on. So as long as you form your opinions based on facts, I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is when people base their opinions on what they believe to be facts, but are clearly untrue. The front page of my website at www.themikebatesshow.com has two quotes at the top of the page, and the one at the very top is from the late Democrat senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts." And my facts aren't my facts. My facts are the facts. Am I self-righteous? Well, I'm right, so what does that mean? Over the many years of doing interactive talk radio, a lot of callers have commented that I am so intelligent and informed. And while I appreciate the compliments, I suppose, I always responded that the reason I usually sound like I know what I'm talking about is because I usually only talk about what I know. I acknowledge there's plenty I don't know. Like if you wanted someone to do a show on college basketball, I'm not your guy. I know two things about college basketball: that Duke is usually pretty good, and that the only month you hear the word Gonzaga is March. But when it comes to politics, American history, and law, especially constitutional law, I know far more than most people, including most lawyers. And while I'm certain you think that's an unjustified brag, the truth is that most lawyers get one semester of constitutional law at law school and then never think about it again unless they specialize in it. Well, I've studied constitutional law for 40 years. I read Supreme Court decisions for fun, and to learn, obviously, but I enjoy reading them. And I've had many lawyers and judges, including a federal district court judge, tell me that I understand and articulate constitutional law better than most lawyers. So as Dizzy Dean said, if you can do it, it ain't bragging. Well, I can do it. What I can't do is single-handedly save our republic from the destruction looming on the horizon. But I can and will alert you to it. What I will not do is encourage violence to prevent it. Because I think our problems need to be solved with ballots, not bullets. Which is why I'm so passionately angry about the 2020 presidential election. Not because Trump didn't get reelected. I didn't want Obama to get reelected, and when he did, I was disappointed, not angry. But this year is different. I'm angry. And I'm angry because the legitimacy of the sacred ballot was never confirmed. I'm angry because the Supreme Court, the one institution that could have settled the dispute, refused to. I'm angry because now we'll never know if President Harris was legitimately elected. Yeah, okay, that was unnecessary on my part. Fine. Even though I don't see Joe Biden finishing his term. Where we need to go from here is educating, organizing, and motivating. Something we should have been doing all along, and something Democrats are far better at than Republicans, although they're miseducating. And their organizing and motivating stems from their well-financed, and in many cases taxpayer-financed effort to achieve bigger and bigger government. Whereas Republicans generally want less government. So government isn't the most important thing in their lives, so they don't obsess over it. And I obviously mean Republican voters, not Republican politicians, because Republican politicians are almost as bad as Democrat politicians when it comes to big government and big spending. Decent Americans cannot sit back and let this great nation we inherited be ruined by what the Democratic Party has become. But our actions must not be violent. Republicans have the moral and constitutional high ground in this battle. But if we get violent, we'll lose that. So all this talk about how Donald Trump should declare martial law or how we should start a civil war is crazy talk. Despite the Democrats now being fully in charge after their wins in both Georgia Senate races, we can hopefully stop the worst of their agenda. As long as they don't get rid of the filibuster, as they've threatened to do anyway. But we cannot prevail if we don't take constructive action. And that means skipping that stupid TV show and going to a political meeting instead. It means talking to your friends and neighbors about what is happening in government instead of talking about who got a rose on The Bachelor. It means sharing political news rather than cat videos on your social media. And it means donating to groups that promote conservative causes in lieu of going out to dinner. And it also means not quitting. You know, the Tea Party had great success stopping the worst of the Obama agenda in 2010. But then they declared victory and went home. And Democrats roared back in 2012. Why? Because Democrats didn't quit. Because they worship big government, they obsess over big government. And because they obsess over big government, they never stop trying to grow it. And along with it, their power. Now, it doesn't help the situation that big media, big tech, academia, and that's not just college, by the way. K through 12 is also filled with leftist indoctrination now. It doesn't help that leftism dominates almost every aspect of society. But the leftists didn't achieve that domination overnight. They fought for it for decades. Democrats play the long game, and Republicans play the short game. In much the same way that communists play the long game, and capitalists play the short game. And for the same reasons. Well, if we don't get off our collective asses and do something to save this republic, the communists will win. And when they do, then it's game over. And today's Democrats are communists. Sure, they call themselves socialists, but a socialist is just a communist that hasn't fulfilled all his dreams yet. We must stop the Democrat agenda before it's too late. And it's not too late yet. But that battle must be done, and it must be won. Because you can vote your way into communism, but you have to shoot your way out of it. And we don't want that. All right, let's take our break. When we get back, I will play for you the interview I conducted Thursday morning with Sam Mullins, who used to chair the Santa Rosa County Republican Executive Committee and was in attendance in Washington during the protest. I'll play that interview when the Mike Bates Show continues. So this is Mike Bates. Sam Mullins, who is a former chairman of the Santa Rosa County Republican Executive Committee, was in Washington at the protest at the Capitol on Wednesday. I talked to him Thursday morning as he was driving home from Washington, and I recorded that conversation so we could include it on today's show, so let's play it now. I've got Sam Mullins on the line. Sam Mullins was among the attendees. He did not breach the Capitol building itself, but he was a witness to the events, so let's talk to him. Sam, welcome to the Mike Bates Show.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
So let's begin with why you went to Washington. The news media wants people to think that you went to Washington to mount a coup. Was that your intent?
No, that is totally false. The people that went to Washington, the people that were in the crowd, we were there showing our support for the president and to our legislative members to follow the Constitution and doing away with the voter fraud.
Okay, but then the president spoke to the crowd, and I guess he asked you to mount a coup and overthrow the United States government. Is that correct? I mean, that's what the media is telling us.
That is completely false. What he asked us to do, he said in his speech that he and Pence had spoken and that they were of like minds and that we would have the chance in our legislative body there in D.C. to present the case against the fraud that had been perpetrated in the election. And he wanted the supporters there to march to the Capitol to show support of the effort to have that argument heard, that evidence heard, so that we could get that evidence heard and out to the world. And that hopefully our legislators there would know and see the people outside and know that we were there in support of our vice president, who was supposedly of the same mind as the president on the voter fraud issues and the same mind as many Republicans and conservatives are, that our election was stolen from Donald J. Trump and done so with various forms of voter fraud.
Well, I think the stronger argument, I don't know how often you listen to the program, and I don't know if you've read my blog posts or not, but I think the stronger argument is that the elections were unconstitutionally conducted in at least 6 states. Was there fraud? Yes, there absolutely was. Are we going to be able to prove there was enough fraud to overcome the margin of Joe Biden's victory? 1, it's unlikely, and 2, it sure isn't going to happen in time. And of course, now it's too late. It's already done. But even back in November 4th, there was no way we could do that because there's not enough time to prove all of this. I mean, you got Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell. They're making all these claims, but they're not coming up with enough evidence to prove anything. So I think the stronger argument was the constitutional argument because those facts are not in dispute. What the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and also California and New Jersey, but those are somewhat irrelevant, the processes they went through for their elections are not in accordance with their laws and their constitutions, and that is not in dispute. Now, what is in dispute is, but does that reason overthrow the election? Okay, but the actual facts are not in dispute. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court refused to hear it, and so we'll never officially know. But let's get beyond the fraud allegations themselves and just talk about what occurred on Wednesday. Where were you when the president spoke?
Mike, we were about 2/3 of the way between the White House and the Washington Monument. That's where they had set the stage up, and we were there probably about 150 yards maybe from the actual stage where the president was speaking.
Okay, so that's the ellipse north of the mall.
Correct.
So when the president finished his speech, where'd you go?
We all started marching toward the Capitol. But if you've ever been to D.C.
Oh, I've spent a lot of time in D.C., and it's quite a hike from the White House to the Capitol building.
It's a good hike. So the crowd started moving and going that way, and we were kind of toward the front. I mean, we weren't in the very front by no means, but the crowd was huge. And that's one thing I want to say real quick. The media is saying that there was only 10,000 people. No. One of the people I went with was Chris Joseph, who most of you know has been a part of the pro-life movement and was there for the March for Life when they said they had 175,000 people. And he said the crowd there was at least 4 to 5 times what the crowd was for the March for Life.
So you're heading towards the mall, meaning you're heading south, and then you turned left on the mall towards the Capitol. So you're now heading east on the mall towards the Capitol building. And it, as I said a moment ago, it's quite a hike. I've walked it many times, and it's not a round-the-block thing. It's a good ways. So how close were you to the front of this group of people that was marching toward the Capitol building?
There was probably a good, I'm going to say 40 or 50,000 people in front of us easily,
okay.
And with probably several times that behind us as we're marching toward the Capitol.
So how close did you yourself get to the Capitol building?
We got within approximately 350 to 400 yards. We were close enough to see things when things started happening and hear things.
Did you and the people you were in Washington with, and I obviously don't mean all 100,000 of them, but the handful of friends that you were with, did you all in any way breach any security perimeters or knock down any fences or anything?
No, we did not.
Okay, so how close were you able to get before any kind of security was encountered?
We started seeing police along the route, approximately about halfway to the Capitol building, staged in front of the various government buildings.
Was there any police resistance to your movement?
No, none at all. We were allowed freely to march toward the Capitol. And it was a very festive thing. I mean, this was more like you've seen at the other Trump rallies. People were singing, chanting, doing chants, and some were singing, one of the songs was the Battle Hymn of the Republic. They were singing that. Others, God Bless America, Star Spangled Banner. And, people were singing, and it was a very festive thing. I mean, we had some of the protesters, one of them was dressed up as Captain America, and he was out there, And so, I mean, it was that kind of thing. People were there of all ages. I mean, from small children that parents had brought in their little backpacks with them, sitting on their shoulders, and to 80, 90-year-old great grandparents, out there walking in their canes and in their little motor scooters, the little wheelchair thing. And so the crowd, it was what we see in America, that all races, all colors participated in this.
So until the Capitol building itself was breached, was the protest 100% peaceful?
You had an occasional agitator in the crowd that would say that we need to march on the Capitol. But I mean, it was like we saw just a handful of these people scattered through the crowd. And there was a comment made by some people that they're wondering if these guys were plants.
Trying to instigate something.
Correct. That is correct. We were marching down, and when we got about 2/3 of the way to the Capitol, we're checking their phones to see what the news was reporting about the march. As they were marching, they were looking at their cell phones, and people started saying they were getting texts and reports that Pence had already agreed to go with the Democrats, was not going to hear any evidence, and that they had already signed a thing certifying the existing electoral votes, and that basically he had turned his back on the Republican Party and the president. And so at that point, and then, of course, you had people saying this and talking to one another as we're walking down, and you did have a few people that they were disgusted at what this meant. And like I said, you had some of the agitators, ones that I thought were possible agitators, shouting, "Let's storm," and it was just one or two here or there that said that. And from what we saw and from what I was able to discern from some of the other people that were up closer, that it was just a handful that breached the Capitol. The rest of the people stood behind the barriers, and it was not a ruckus or rowdy crowd. The only thing that gave off a hint that anything was wrong is all of a sudden we heard a couple of pops and saw a few puffs of what we found out later was tear gas to the left of the Capitol. On the left side of the Capitol building is where I think they actually made the breach as you're facing the Capitol building. And then we had people, as we were trying to make our way out of there, that had been up front telling us what they saw.
So, Sam, you said you got between 300 and 400 yards of the Capitol. Could you see from that distance people scaling the west wall of the building?
I didn't see anybody scaling the west wall. I know that there was a picture they showed on the news of one person that I saw on the news.
Oh, no, they definitely did. A lot of people scaled the walls. So whether that happened or not is not in doubt. It happened. I was just curious if you were close enough to see it happen.
No, because I was right dead front, so I could not see the left side that well. That's what I'm saying.
It was west, W-E-S-T.
Yes, it was on the west side, facing west of the Capitol. As we were facing north at the Capitol, it was on the left-hand side, which would have been the west side of the Capitol building.
Oh, I see. Okay. So at what point did you become aware that the Capitol building itself had been penetrated by the protesters?
About the time we saw the tear gas going off, word had made it back through the crowd just as people were talking. You could hear people yelling from up front of us, the Capitol's been breached, the Capitol's been breached. And people were turning around looking at each other. And I mean, within seconds, that's when we heard the pop, and saw the tear gas and smoke.
And did the people around you seem pleased that the Capitol building had been breached, or were they shocked as if they didn't think that should happen?
Complete shock. Nobody, people's jaws were literally dropping. People's mouths were literally dropping wide open because they could not believe what they were hearing and seeing.
So how long before the group you were in got pushed away from the Capitol?
Well, me personally, like I said, we were about 350, 400 yards, so we weren't personally pushed back. But when we started hearing the pop of the tear gas canisters going off and seeing the puffs of tear gas, And we actually audibly heard what we thought might have been gunfire. And it was going through the crowd that they were firing some rubber bullets. That was being put out through the crowd as well. And we heard that, and we decided, well, going forward to the steps of the Capitol was not a good option. So we decided it was time to make our way as quickly as we could out of D.C. And we actually walked approximately a block over and was trying to get an Uber ride back to the motel where our car was.
All right, so we're going to pause that interview just long enough to take this quick commercial break. Then we'll come back with the second half of it when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. This is the second half of the interview I conducted with Sam Mullins as he was driving home Thursday morning from the protests in Washington, D.C. So, Sam, it sounds like you personally and the people that were in your group did not actually have a direct encounter with either law enforcement or tear gas fired by law enforcement.
We were able to be within earshot and eye shot of what went on as far as the tear gas being fired. And then we did see hundreds of police at that point within less than 5 minutes. I mean, they started pouring in from everywhere. And for the next half hour, there was sirens and police and National Guard, MRAPs and everything being deployed throughout the city.
And what time did you actually leave the district?
About 45 minutes to an hour after the actual discharge of the tear gas. And we ended up making it as far south as Bristol, Tennessee before we stopped for the night.
Well, you were wise to get out of town like you did and not engage the police.
Well, and that's the thing. People were there. This was not a riot. It was a peaceful protest. It was meant to be a peaceful protest, not a riot. And my issue is with what's being reported on the news from the crowd sizes to what went on and trying to paint the whole group as nothing but a riot and trying to paint the president as being the instigator who was not the instigator at all.
So what now, Sam?
Well, I know this. We've got to be in prayer for our nation. This is the biggest crisis we've had, I think, since the Civil War, if not the actual founding of our nation. And we've got to find some way to be able to get back to our Constitution. And we've got to have our states stand up to their responsibilities as well. And that's been part of the problem in all of this long, like you talked about in the swing states. Their legislators failed at their job. Our Supreme Court failed at its job. And I believe that our elected officials in Washington, D.C. failed at their job. So it's been failure all around.
Well, I assign the blame to the Supreme Court myself. Them refusing to hear the case of Texas v. Pennsylvania to actually rule on the evidence and not just dismiss it for lack of standing, which arguably was an improper dismissal because I think Texas absolutely has standing. But I blame all of this on the Supreme Court. They are the referees. They were asked to make the call, and they went to the locker room. It was disgraceful.
Mike, I totally agree. And, the Supreme Court, I blame them. They have probably as much blame as anyone in this, if not the most. But I also have to blame the state legislatures for not standing up for their own authority and allowing their authority to be usurped by these rogue secretaries of states and rogue governors, and standing up for the voters and for the legitimate vote and allowing that legitimate vote to be watered down by the fraud.
Yeah, certainly the state legislatures are to blame too, and so are the governors and the secretaries of state. Anybody that allowed the election to be conducted outside of the lawful constitutional parameters of the individual states and the U.S. Constitution is responsible for this. The reason I blame the Supreme Court is because once that illegal election was conducted, really the only remedy was for the court to throw out the results because the elections were unconstitutional. I think it would have been improper for the legislature after the vote to go back and say, well, we think the election was run unconstitutionally, so we're going to change it. That would set a terrible precedent. But for the Supreme Court to do it, it would have been appropriate. And the fact that they didn't even try was disgraceful. It would have been the proper role of the Supreme Court to invalidate the votes, and then throw it to the state legislatures because there is a backup plan. The Constitution allows the backup plan. And the backup plan is the state legislatures get to decide. But it would have been improper for the state legislatures to take that on themselves. If the Supreme Court had invalidated the results of the unconstitutional elections, then the state legislatures should have acted. But they were never given that opportunity by the court because the court refused to do its constitutional duty.
Mike, I want to interject here, if I may, for just a second. I want to let the people know what we saw on the ground as we were walking past the Supreme Court buildings on our way down towards the Capitol. There was about 4,000 or 5,000 that had stopped at that point and put up a banner that said, "We the people," and were shouting, "Do your job, do your job." And the rest of us that were walking by were chanting it with them as we walked by, headed toward the Capitol. And at that point, I mean, none of those people were trying to breach the Supreme Court building either, but they were letting their voice be heard in D.C. that they were not happy with the Supreme Court decision.
All right, I'm confused by that, Sam, because the Supreme Court building is on the east side of the Capitol, and if you were coming down the mall, you'd have been approaching the Capitol from the west. So what route took you past the Supreme Court building?
When we came down, we actually ended up going over several blocks and then coming down is what we ended up, and then coming back over to try to avoid some of the crowd. But I just wanted to let you know that as we passed that part, there was a group there.
Okay, so you approached the Capitol building from the north, not from the west. Okay.
Right. But we came around to the front part of it.
And you would have been on the east side then if you saw the Supreme Court building. Okay. Well, that's why you didn't see the people scaling the walls, because that happened on the west side.
Right.
So, Sam, what would you like to see happen next?
I just want to ask people to please be in prayer. And we've got to be in prayer for our country. We've got to find Republican legislative members in our state and federal level that have a spine and will stand up for what's right and not cave, and will uphold the Constitution, because we've seen that in effect now, and that's part of the problem of what happened in D.C. And so I just ask for prayers, and I ask for those that are part of the conservative movement to rethink allowing these weak-kneed legislative members to continue with their political careers.
Well, Sam Mullins, I appreciate you joining us today on the Mike Bates Show. Great to have your first-hand information. I know you're a great patriot. I know you love this country. I know that you do support law and order, which is why you were in Washington. You were simply asking for law and order.
Yes, sir, that is correct. Thank you so much.
All right, so I've got lots more I'd like to say, but with the conclusion of that interview, there is no time left for me to say it. So that makes this the end of today's edition of the Mike Bates Show. Thanks for listening. I'm Mike Bates.